live in 5. All right, awesome. So, the name of this episode is You, Me, and the FCC. I was going to name it after an episode of Family Guy that had a slightly different take on it, but I thought that would be inappropriate. So, it's You, Me, and the FCC, and talking about the Federal Communications Commission and sort of the effect that it's going to have in the new administration going forward, particularly with regards to the internet and net neutrality. So, if you don't know, um, basically a new FCC commissioner was appointed recently, um, and his views differ very much from the previous administration, as you'd probably expect. Um, and so I just want to go into a little bit of details of that, let you know what's going on. Obviously, again, this is stuff that we have to look at going forward to see how much of this actually becomes reality or not. But I've got this neat little thing I set up. See if it works. All right. And then I do this. Oh, there he is. All right. So this is Ajit Pai. Ajit Pai is the new FCC commissioner. He was appointed by the Trump administration. He's a former lawyer with Verizon, which immediately should send off alarm bells. But I think you'd be surprised that a lot of the people who end up working in these sort of regulatory agencies are actually, former employees or lobbyists or people who used to work for the telecommunications industry. So, it's no point talking about regulatory capture at this point. So, anyway, this is the guy. Let's talk a little bit about, first of all, what the previous view was. So, previously it was under Tom Wheeler. And it's interesting because I remember people going absolutely nuts back when all of the internet blackout and all that stuff was happening. People going really nuts over Tom Wheeler because he was also a veteran of the telecommunications industry. And, people were saying, well, this is a guy who is, as much of an insider as you can imagine. So they were very afraid of the kinds of things that the FCC under him, what they were going to end up doing. Turns out, to his credit, they did a pretty good job. I think a lot of people were really happy with a lot of the decisions that the FCC made. Not perfect, but um, one of the most important things that he did was with regards to, and what we're going to be talking about here, is regards to net neutrality. All right. So net neutrality, if you don't know, is where an ISP or any sort of a service provider of the internet is required to make certain that every every bit is treated equally. And sometimes people will try to muddy the waters and talk about quality of service and stuff. But if you're a technical person, you know that that doesn't make any sense. But basically, what it means is that it's not based on application, or it's not based on application, but even based on the company providing that service. So let me see if I can explain this. So let's say you have Netflix, which provides video streaming. You have Hulu, which provides video streaming. You have Amazon Prime Video, which provides internet streaming. A company cannot go to, uh, cannot go to a service provider and say, Amazon can't go to a service provider and say, we'll pay you more if you prioritize our bits, our video bits, over our competitors. And then they have a little bidding war and stuff like that goes on. You're not allowed to do that under net neutrality. And also, the actual ISP is not allowed to offer that kind of service to those companies. One of the big fears, particularly, is with the idea that a lot of these companies that actually own the internet services are also the same people who own the physical connections. And so they could prioritize their own uh, services over their competitors very easily that way without even having to get into all of this money business, right? And so if, Comcast decides to start its own video streaming service, then they could prioritize their own bits to the exclusion of everyone else. And obviously that's not a good idea. That's not competitive at all. So the principle of net neutrality is that you're not allowed to do that. Video is video, and you send all of it, right? Um, So under the FCC previously, they said that not only would they defend net neutrality, but that they would define it as a Title II service under the Communications Act. So the Communications Act, 1934, which I was just reading about today, basically you have Title I services, which are information services like cable television, right? And then you have sort of public services or more important or more essential services under Title II that increases the ability of the FCC to regulate those services. And so that would include things like, well, like the internet until recently, but also things like telephone services, things like that. Where there's a lot of more restrictions on what you're allowed to do because it's considered an essential service for, people to live. So the previous administration, that was their stance, as they said, we're going to protect net neutrality. We're going to file lawsuits if we think people are going against net neutrality or trying to circumvent it. And we consider the internet to be a Title II service under the Communications Act. So that's where we were. Now, here are a few things that's changed. Basically, that's all flipped around. Ajit Pai here, he had already been kind of outspoken against a lot of net neutrality rules. I don't think that, that everything he said has been clearly against net neutrality, but he's certainly been against, some of against the previous administration's classification. So I want to talk about 3 different issues that I think highlight what's already going on. These are things that have already happened, not just things that we think are going to happen, but things that have already happened. And I think that they kind of clearly demonstrate the way things are going. So first, let's see if I can do this. Oops. Oh, look at that. For your visual entertainment, there's a picture of the Federal Communications Commission's logo. So the first thing is zero rating. So you may have heard of this term. Zero rating literally just means free, right? So a company like T-Mobile comes out and says, we will not charge you data charges for this particular kind of content. So they'll say, if you stream your videos from Netflix, then we won't charge you at all for that. And that's an agreement that they and Netflix put together, right? So Netflix and T-Mobile get together and they make this agreement, and they hash out the details of how that's going to work. And then they put out this offer that says, if you use Netflix on T-Mobile, you will not pay data charges at all. You'll still pay data charges if you use Amazon Video, if you use Hulu, if you use any other kind of streaming service, but Netflix, it's free. Now, that sounds fantastic, obviously, but the problem is that seems to be, if you were following the discussion earlier, to be a violation of net neutrality, right? Because now you're saying that you're going to allow customers to not pay for one service but continue to pay for another one, right? Even if they're maybe getting both for free, like if we look at an example of a non-paid service, you would still effectively be charging them for one and not charging them for another because of the data plan. So that's what's considered anti-competitive in the previous FCC administration, and that has been dropped by this one. So there was an investigation into that had been started by the previous FCC chairman, and that is no longer taking place. Which brings us to the first big point, and that is that they don't have to actively do anything. They just merely have to drop investigations and not enforce rules and regulations that were in place before. So it can be a little bit muddy sometimes to figure out what they end up wanting to do, but they don't have to actually repeal anything. They can just not enforce it. So in this case, they just said, we're dropping our investigation into zero rating. All right, so there's that. The other thing is the wireless auction. So they auctioned off a bunch of wireless spectrum. And these are basically, when the FCC was first founded and they were, tasked with sort of splitting up the spectrum for things like broadcast television, wireless internet hadn't been invented yet and it hadn't been speculated to exist. So they didn't know about that. So as wireless technology started developing and people started wanting to make more wireless systems, they found themselves restricted to very specific parts of the spectrum that they could use that wasn't either used up by broadcast television or by the military or these other places. And it was all regulated by the FCC. Now what's happened is that in order to expand the amount of wireless spectrum, the amount of spectrum that we can use for wireless internet, the FCC went out and they basically paid some companies for it, for their existing spectrum that they weren't really using, and they hacked off little bits and pieces there, here and there, and they auctioned it off to a few of the big mobile companies, and like Verizon, Comcast, Dish, T-Mobile, all those people. And they're expected to have made $19.6 billion in that. So that's definitely going to help quite a lot with wireless advancement and internet technology. And that was something that it had already been started under the previous administration, but it did go through and it did continue. So that's a good sign. Let's see here. And then the last one that I wanted to mention is actually, this is a really important one, and that is the AT&T and Time Warner merger. So I don't even know what the full name of either of these organizations are anymore, because they've merged into these massive conglomerates. But if you can believe it, they want to get even bigger. And so AT&T-Time Warner, we're looking to merge. And of course, AT&T is mostly they mostly provide connection services, telecommunication services, and Time Warner they provide actual services, so or content producer. And that again, they're such massive organizations at this point that they have very broad business goals, but that sort of hits at the center of this, right? When you have the people who make the medium and the people who are making the actual message or making the content that goes over the medium, anytime you look at those two groups coming together, you're running the risk of violating those principles of net neutrality. And then you end up in that situation like I was describing earlier, where you have basically an anti-competitive market, particularly in places that don't have a lot of choice in terms of which provider that they go with, which I know we've discussed in the chapter with regards to North Carolina before. But those kinds of places particularly would be restricted to whatever content is being produced by the people who happen to be hooked up with the provider that they have available. So all of those pretty much violate the essential elements of what makes the internet great, and that is the idea that everyone can connect to everyone, that anyone can produce content, that anyone can access anyone else's content. You want Amazons and PayPals and Netflixes and these other kinds of companies that no one had ever heard of 50 years ago to continue to be able to be created and incubated and grown on the internet. You don't just want these huge, massive conglomerates, coming through and dominating everything as usual. Otherwise, the internet turns into cable television, which isn't very good. So that's all I really had to talk about. I did have my little experiment with my stuff there. Between my bad teeth and the presentation thing on the side, I feel like John Oliver. But hopefully a few of those things will be taken care of here soon. And I did want to end this one just with a reminder that we are meeting at Mez on the 25th at 5 o'clock. You can find all the information on our website, isoc-nc.org. I fixed it so that I fixed the redirect so that you can now put www in front of it as well. So we're moving into the 21st century there. We also have a mail set up now, so you can email admin@isoc-nc.org, and I'll be able to check that and respond to any emails or inquiries that you might have. But yeah, that's all I really wanted to do. Like I said, we'll be following up with this as we actually, there's tons and tons of rumors. I could spend hours talking about the rumors of what's going on and what they think is going to happen. But I would rather just talk about what's actually happened so far. So we'll see whether or not any of that stuff goes anywhere. And we'll continue to have these sorts of discussions once a week, where maybe instead of focusing it on just one topic per week, I'll have to split it up because of multiple things will be happening. I expect things are going to get pretty hectic and pretty crazy over the next year, so we'll see. But anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next week.